The knock came just as I was tying my son's shoelaces, the morning sun cutting through our tiny apartment like it always did, soft but revealing, showing the peeling paint, the thrift store couch, the life I was trying to hold together with quiet determination. And when I opened the door, I genuinely thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Because standing there in a tailored charcoal coat and heels that probably cost more than my monthly rent was the woman whose face dominated business. Magazines, billboards, and keynote stages around the world, the CEO everyone called untouchable, her posture calm, her eyes sharp, and yet right then they held something else entirely as she looked at me and said, almost gently, "You forgot something last night." And in that moment my son tugged at my hand asking who she was, and the past 24 hours crashed back into me. The spilled coffee at the charity gala I never should have been invited to, the way she'd laughed instead of getting angry, how we'd ended up talking in a quiet corner about loss, about raising a child alone, about how success doesn't insulate you from loneliness, and how at the end of the night I'd rushed out because my babysitter had called, leaving behind the one thing I never leave anywhere, my late wife's old notebook, the one where I write letters to my son for the future, and now this powerful woman was holding it out to me like it was fragile, like it mattered, and my neighbors were watching from their doors, and I felt that old familiar shame crawl up my spine, the voice telling me I didn't belong anywhere near someone like her. But she didn't look embarrassed, she didn't look annoyed, she looked concerned, kneeling slightly so she could meet my son's eyes, introducing herself like she was just another adult passing through life, not the woman who could buy the building we stood in without blinking. And when she stood back up she said she had a meeting in an hour but didn't want to leave without making sure I got this back, because some things are too important to forget, and something about the way she said it, like she was talking about more than a notebook, made my chest tighten, and before I knew it she was inside our apartment, sipping instant coffee without judgment, listening while my son explained his toy collection, and when she finally stood to leave she paused at the door and said, "I don't usually do this, but if you ever need anything, here," slipping a card into my hand, and as she walked away I had no idea that this knock wasn't the end of an awkward encounter, but the beginning of a collision between two lives that had been quietly breaking in very different ways, and if you're still with me right now, this is where you'll want to subscribe, because what happened next changed everything. I told myself not to call, days passed, then weeks, life doing what it always did, school runs, late-night laundry, grief that never fully leaves, but then the letter from the landlord came, the one with words like, "Final notice," and pride became a luxury I couldn't afford, and when I finally dialed the number on that card, expecting an assistant or voicemail, she answered herself, remembered my son's name, asked how we were, and within hours my problem became a meeting, not a handout, not pity, but an offer for contract work I was actually qualified for, and I watched my life slowly stabilize while she kept showing up in quiet ways, checking in, attending my son's school event in the back row unnoticed, listening when I talked about my wife like she wasn't afraid of grief, and one night after my son fell asleep she admitted something she'd never said on any stage, that she'd built an empire because it was easier than going home to an empty apartment, that power is loud but loneliness is louder. And when I told her I was afraid of letting someone close again she didn't rush me, she just said, "I knocked because you mattered," and months later, when that same woman stood at my door again, not as a CEO but as someone asking if we could try building something real, slowly, imperfectly, I realized success isn't about who has more, it's about who shows up when it counts, and as my son laughed between us, safe and seen, I understood that sometimes the most powerful people aren't the ones who command rooms, but the ones who choose connection over convenience, and if this story moved you even a little, if you believe second chances can come from the most unexpected knocks, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this remind us that no matter how broken life feels, it only takes one moment, one choice, to begin again. The third knock came late at night, softer than the first two but heavier in meaning. And this time I knew it was her before I opened the door, not because of the sound but because my chest tightened the same way it had begun to do whenever my life stood on the edge of change, and when I saw her standing there without the coat, without the armor of boardrooms and headlines, holding nothing but her phone and a look that was almost afraid. I understood that power doesn't protect you from the moments when you don't know where to stand, and she didn't step inside right away. She asked if she could, as if this small apartment belonged to something sacred, and my son was asleep in the next room, the soft rhythm of his breathing reminding me that every decision I made echoed into someone else's future, and she sat on the edge of the couch like she didn't quite trust herself yet and finally said that the board had turned on her, that the very people who praised her strength were now calling her too emotional, too distracted. Words sharpened by the fact that she'd been seen too often in places that weren't glass towers, and I felt anger rise in me, not for myself, but for her, because I recognized the pattern too well, the way the world punishes people the moment they stop pretending they're invincible, and she admitted that she was scared, not of losing money or titles, but of losing the one place where she didn't have to perform, and when she asked me if she was making a mistake getting close to us, I realized how strange life is. How the woman millions feared for her authority was sitting in my living room asking a single dad if she was allowed to care, and I told her the truth, that fear never disappears, that loving my son after losing his mother meant waking up every day knowing something precious could be taken again, but that I'd learned avoiding love doesn't prevent pain, it only prevents meaning, and something in her cracked then, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for tears to fall without apology. And I held space for them the way no one ever had for mine, and when she left that night she didn't promise anything, she didn't ask anything either, but the next morning headlines exploded, rumors twisted kindness into weakness, and I watched her walk into the storm with the same calm she'd shown at my door, except now I knew the strength behind it, and weeks later when she stood on a stage and spoke not about profits but about humanity, about leadership that includes compassion instead of hiding from it, I knew she was risking everything. And when my son asked why people were being mean to his friend, I knelt and told him that sometimes doing the right thing costs you comfort, but it gives you something better, and that night, as messages poured in, some hateful, some grateful, I understood that our lives were no longer separate stories running in parallel, they were intertwined, shaping each other in ways neither of us had planned, and if you've stayed with this story until now, this is the moment it stops being just about a CEO and a single dad, and starts being about courage, connection, and choosing love when it would be easier to hide. So make sure you subscribe, because what comes next is the most unexpected turn of all. The fourth knock never came, because by the time everything fell apart, she didn't need to knock anymore, she already felt like part of the quiet rhythm of our lives, and it was strange how loss announces itself not with noise but with absence, because the morning her company officially forced her out, there were no cameras at our door, no dramatic phone calls. Just her standing in my kitchen staring at the steam rising from a mug of tea she hadn't touched, her shoulders tense like someone bracing for impact that had already happened, and when she finally said, "It's done," it didn't sound like defeat, it sounded like exhaustion finally giving itself permission to rest, and I watched the world's former most powerful woman sit at our small table helping my son with his homework, nodding as if this simple moment, was something she had been starving for all along, and the headlines were cruel, calling her reckless, emotional, distracted, but my son didn't know any of that, he only knew she listened when he spoke, that she remembered the names of his imaginary characters, that she showed up, and that night when he fell asleep she confessed that for the first time in decades she didn't know who she was without the title, without the armor. And I told her about the day I realized I was no longer just a grieving husband but a father who had to learn how to be enough on his own, and we sat there in the quiet understanding that identity isn't what the world calls you, it's what you choose to protect when everything else is stripped away, and the next weeks were hard, money tightened for her in ways she'd never experienced, judgment followed her everywhere, but something unexpected happened too, opportunities that aligned with her values instead of exploiting her ambition. People reaching out because her vulnerability had given them courage, and when she decided to start something new, not a company but a foundation focused on humane leadership, she asked me to be part of it, not as charity, not as a favor, but as a partner who understood resilience from the inside. And the day she moved in, quietly, without announcement, my son asked if this meant we were a family now, and she knelt in front of him and said, "If you'll have me." And I felt my chest ache with a hope I'd been afraid to name. And months later when she stood on a small stage, not a global summit, but a community hall, and told her story honestly, without polish or protection, I realized that the most powerful thing she'd ever built wasn't a corporation, it was a life rooted in truth. And as I watched my son clap proudly beside me, I knew that some knocks change your night, some change your year, but a few rare ones change who you become forever. And if this story reminded you that life can still surprise you, that love can arrive without warning, and that real power is choosing people over pride, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be the one that knocks on your door when you least expect it.